Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to this session on cryptic cycles, Anne Lister's cousin, and 19th century menstrual practices. I'll start by introducing the topic, the panelists, and myself. Then we'll have a 30-minute conversation with our three panelists, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. So if you think of any questions while we're talking, just pop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So my name is Mette Hildeman Sjölin. I teach at Halmstad University in Sweden, and during the last few years I've looked at Lister's language and related it to queer theory. So at last year's summit, I gave a talk on Lister's sexual language, and this year I wanted to pitch this session because it struck me that in addition to sex, one of the areas that Lister uses a lot of creative language for in her diaries is menstruation. And this is also an area that hasn't historically been spoken about a lot. So even where we have diaries, historical diaries by presumably menstruating diarists, they may not really have written about that area of their lives. So the fact that Lister is outspoken in this respect provides an opportunity to learn about the history of menstruation. But then at the same time, she's quite vague when she talks about menstruation, in that she uses euphemisms. And of course, she knows what she means when she writes that she uses a napkin, for example. She doesn't really describe that. So I thought it could be really interesting to have a conversation between people who know a lot about Lister and people who know a lot about the history of menstruation. So hopefully we'll get a better picture of Anne Lister's menstruating life, how she conceptualized or thought of menstruation, and perhaps also to what extent she was typical of her time in this respect. So I'm delighted to be joined by three very knowledgeable people who all have different perspectives on this topic: Anna Clark, Elissa Stein, and Laila Straub. Anna Clark teaches at the University of Minnesota. She has most recently written about Anne Lister in a chapter titled Anne Lister's Search for the Anatomy of Sex in the collection edited by Chris Rolston and Carolyn Gonda, Decoding Anne Lister. She has also written about Anne Lister in her book Alternative Histories of the Self. Elissa Stein is co-author of Flow, the cultural story of menstruation. She is also a small business owner, an avid crafter, a kidney donor, and an activist in New York City. Laila Straub is a code breaker and member of In Search of Anne Walker, who has spent a lot of time reading about, especially Anne Walker's, but also Anne Lister's cousin, as part of the Anne Walker Health Tracker project. So just to start us off with some background information, cousin is Lister's euphemism for menstruation. So when she writes in her diary, for example, I found my cousin come, she means that she started her period. It's also quite interesting that she apparently thinks of this cousin as male, so she uses pronouns like he to refer back to her cousin. And that's also interesting because when she talks about Anne Walker's period, she often uses the word monsieur, which seems to indicate that this was the euphemism that Anne Walker used. So that is, of course, also a male-coded word. Lister meticulously documented when her cycle began in crypt-hand, noting details such as flow and the use of various materials as napkins or pads. And she also used margin symbols. So she wrote one of the symbols that you can see here on the slide in the margin of her diary when she started her own cycle. And then during the period she lived with Anne Walker, she had another margin symbol for Anne Walker's cousin. So she would track both of their cycles. Even before that, she also wrote down any information on the menstrual cycles of her lover in her diary. So I want to start by talking a little bit about knowledge and beliefs related to menstruation. Lister sometimes talks about her cousin in her diary as being regular or expecting him on a specific date, but at the same time, she believes that grubbling, so fingering essentially, can bring on a woman's cousin, apparently regardless of where in her cycle she happens to be. And of course, unlike many women at the time, Lister had no first-hand experience of the connection between menstruation and pregnancy. So what awareness of menstrual cycles and their relation to fertility would she have had, do you think? Anna, would you like to start?
Yes, I was just looking back at Aristotle's masterpiece to see what she would have known. And Aristotle's masterpiece is a popular kind of marriage manual and book about anatomy, which is plagiarized from a lot of different centuries old sources. And we knew she read it. It was this cheap print thing. It would be a small, cheap book, which she actually, her aunt had confiscated from the maid who had it. And Anne Lister said, I'll dispose of that. And then she reads it. And in that, it follows ancient theories that menstruation was needed to be brought on by heat, and that blocked menstruation, like delayed menstruation, was seen as that it was blocked. So it's like a fluid that was blocked in the body. So you needed heat to get menstruation going. And so Aristotle's masterpiece writes that to unblock menstruation, sex with coition is what they called it, would be a good way of doing that, because that would excite the heat. And sometimes you needed aphrodisiacs. I think other sources say you need aphrodisiacs or herbs. Women would also use herbs to unblock menstruation, could be a way of having an abortion. And they didn't really understand the connection between menstruation and fertility at this time. And took another century really until that was completely understood. But it was a time when they were debating exactly how menstruation and ovulate, the relationship between menstruation and ovulation. And she was pretty much up on anatomy in 1834 by the time she wrote that, but it still was not totally understood.
That's interesting. I think there's she writes about the weather being hot at some point, and that's probably where her cousin comes early. Do you remember that? Yeah. So that's really interesting. Alyssa, did you have a comment on this as well?
Yeah, a couple of quick things backed on what you said. Until like the 50s and 60s, people believed that cold retarded menstruation. And so in, period paraphernalia, don't go in the rain, don't get your feet wet, don't take a cold shower, that would impede it from happening. So it's interesting that those mindsets from thousands of years ago continued on for such a long time. People really didn't know. And the other thing I wanted to add was that back in the day in ancient Greece, they thought that menstruation was a woman's way of expelling bad blood from the body. And so bloodletting came into being as a way for men to experience the same thing. So menstruation was seen as a negative, and having it leave your body was a good thing. And so that's where this other practice came in, because somehow a woman's body was more effective in a small way by getting rid of these bad humors that could be causing illness or stress or debilitation to the body. And so that was another way that people thought about this process that was so unknown, and people didn't know how it was related to fertility or not fertility. Those pieces weren't in place yet. So there were lots of rumors and theories about what it possibly could be.
Interesting. So that this is something that people generally believed at this time, even doctors and so on. Yeah, interesting. Lila.
Well, I just want to say, in terms of Anne Lister, I think she definitely was aware, though, that it is regular. It comes roughly every 28 days or something, because like you said, she does know Anne Walker's period came a week early, or she prepares because she expects her cousin to come on Wednesday and doesn't come. So she's very much aware of that. But at the same time, if you don't understand where the irregularities come from, why not say that a good orgasm could bring on the cousin early or something? I mean, it's understandable that if you don't understand the details of how menstruation actually works, you come up with your own kind of rules.
Yeah, so even if she was aware of the sort of interval that it would happen, she didn't know everything that happened in the body during the cycle.
Yeah, or she thought that good blood flow is also healthy for you. Like if the menstruation is strong, then that's also a good sign for your bodily health.
Yeah, there was Aristotle's masterpiece talks about this debate about whether menstrual blood is harmful or not, referring back to those ancient Greek, literally referring back to the ancient Greek authorities. But they actually say, oh, it's healthy, because they're trying to refute these negative ideas about it's actually very pro-woman in a perverse way. Aristotle's masterpiece, it's very pro-sex. They believed that you had to have an orgasm in order to conceive.
Yeah.
Which is kind of good and bad for women, but and Anne Lister was very aware of all the things. She was also very confused by it because it's very confusing, which is what I write about. She confused the clitoris and the cervix, but that's another story.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that's something we can read about in your chapter that I mentioned, right? Yeah. Then what about what we can deduce about Lister's cousin in terms of regularity? You spoke about that, Lila, a little bit, and duration and symptoms, since she does document it so carefully. For example, she often seems to say that her cousin came gently. That's a phrase that keeps recurring. Do you think this is a reference to a light flow or an absence of pain or perhaps something else? And is this something that varies over time or from month to month? And also, Lila, you've tracked Anne Walker's cousin, of course, in connection with her mental health, which you spoke about at last year's summit as well. So it would be interesting to hear you talk about Anne Walker a little bit here as well.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the cousin came gently, I always understood that she had some first light signs, like a little bit of pink or something on the toilet paper, because I think it makes sense at her age, because our periods change. When we're young, you might wake up in a pool of blood. But then as you get older, it starts slowly. And it also kind of makes sense because sometimes she says, the cousin came gently, but I didn't put anything on. So she would wait a couple of days until, the cousin actually started coming or like properly bleeding. So that's how I interpreted it. In terms of the regularity, yeah, you can see the graph here. So as part of the health tracker project that we're doing in the group of In Search of Anne Walker, we've been tracking Anne Walker's period and decided we might as well track Anne Lister's period in those years, 1832 to 1840, since we're going through the diaries. And you can see that her period, Anne Lister's, is actually very, very regular. The only big gap she has is towards the end of 1839 when they're traveling in Russia, and she herself comments on that. In December, when they arrive in Moscow, she writes that she got her cousin for the first time since entering Russia, which would have been like in early mid-September. So that's the only big gap I know of. 1838, I'm not sure if there was a gap or not, because there are weeks missing. They're traveling in and out of France and Spain, so she skipped some of the days in her diary, so maybe she had a period at that point. The smaller little gaps, they're not really irregularities. It's just sometimes, for example, in 1834, she had 2 periods in April, at the beginning and at the end of April, and then the next one would be at the beginning of June. So it's just variation in cycle length. She's not really skipping a period. And you can see Anne Walker's period in comparison, it is more irregular. She also knows that. She tells that to Anne Lister that the cousin comes irregular, and she often suffers for a week. And that's also something you can see if you read the diaries. She's often poorly for a few days, and then, a couple of days later, she gets her period. Similar to Anne Lister, she has little gaps, like in 1838, there's 2 periods in August, none in September, and then at the early beginning of October, another one. So I think her cycle length, she's also younger, it's also still longer. So sometimes she would have 32 days or something. So it looks like it skips a month, but it actually is still quite regular for her. But of course, there are these bigger gaps that are quite visible. So in 33, 36, and 39, and maybe a bit of 1840 as well. And that's what I mentioned in my last talk. It kind of coincides with her being very low in those months, her mental health kind of declining. I can't say for sure that it is a cause or the reason for the lack of period, but it seems to correlate at least. Yeah.
So, and the phrase came gently. Do you find that that happens more towards the end of her life and not so much when she's younger?
That I don't
Well,
know, because I
that's the
haven't read
theory.
the early diaries in detail, and
Okay.
I'm not sure if she also recorded that detail.
Okay. No, right. That would be interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense, though, the theory about her period being, you know, lighter and lighter. And does anyone else have any comments here? It's Lila's particular area of expertise. So
Well, I was just
Yeah.
so interested in like whether they had pain or not. And it sounds like PMS, and I'm thinking I should look into insanity and, you know, if they tied it to PMS, which I don't know. But I also have I don't know if you're going to talk about the material she used, and I'm old enough that I remember when you didn't have adhesive menstrual pads and you're supposed to have little belts. They're just horrible. How did she hold up the pads or the rags?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's kind of my next point, the materials and protection. So that's great. Let's talk about that. As one of you mentioned, I think she often writes about preparing for her cousin when she knows that that it's due. And sometimes she mentions wearing a napkin, a stocking, paper, or linen. So she does specify some materials. She also speaks of washing cousin stockings, and burning cousin papers. And she says that paper napkins chafe when she walks. So her preference is for paper napkins. She says that she often goes the whole first day without putting anything on, as you mentioned, Lila, as well. While Mariana on one occasion goes through 30 napkins in 3 days. So what would these different types of sanitary products have looked like? How were they used? What did Lister concretely do when she writes that she was preparing for her cousin? And as Anna says, how did she attach these napkins to her body, to her clothes? Alyssa, is this something you can tell us a bit about?
Or I can make some summations based on what little information is out there. So this is amazing to find somebody who chronicled and took such copious notes about her cycle and talked about the products that she used, because this exists almost nowhere. And very few people paid attention to or wrote about menstruation because it was something that was so private and secret, and it was a woman's issue. So it was just not spoken about very often. I would say that mentioning paper is a sign of privilege. Most people in the world didn't have access to paper or to use something so easily disposable as a product. So that's something that was not typical of the time. But what was typical of the time was using fabric, rags, things that could be easily washed. You know, I've read about, and I've even spoken to people who remember weekly boiling pots, where women of a community would bring all their used fabric and blood-soaked pieces and boil them in a pot of water to use again, and then fold them up and put them away in a cabinet to use. They were not particularly absorbent. You know, now we have things that are, but there was a lot of leaking. And so wearing a stocking or something on top could help prevent it. Petticoats absorbed a lot of menstrual flow. And so when there was a coarser or a darker material used underneath, like a prettier dress, part of it was to absorb that flow. So there wasn't always a way to catch it. In the way that people wore dresses and skirts and petticoats and things tied around your waist, you could fasten fabric almost in the way of a belt that came into being in the 1900s, where you could tie fabric in the front and tie fabric in the back. It was not escape proof. It was not perfect. It did not absorb everything. And then there were some companies starting in the late 1800s who would sell things like a rubber apron that women would wear tied in the front and down the back, so menstrual blood wouldn't seep into their clothing. It would slide to the back and then drop off somewhere else. People sold rubber bloomers, which were fraught with infection causing because you're trapping all that moisture in a woman's body. But that was a way that a woman could go out into the world and participate and not worry about what she was going to do if she had her period and where the blood was going to go.
And you really wouldn't want to leak onto your dress, right? Because it was so difficult to wash the whole dress.
Right. We didn't have, there were no washing machines, there were, no easy care, no dry cleaners to send things to. So that's, again, part of the layers was fashion, but part of it was an absorbency that would protect the more delicate fabrics on the outside from the things that might be going on the inner layer. And again, coarser, more absorbent fabric, you have to think after a while, those would need to be cleaned as well. I've read stories of how they could almost stand up on their own because the dried blood would create a more a firmness to the fabric. But then the blood stains didn't matter as much if it was on a darker fabric and it was underneath things so people couldn't see it.
So you mentioned paper and disposable things being obviously expensive and people not being able to afford that. So when she does talk about using paper and burning the papers afterwards, so disposing of them, is that a sign that she was quite well off, or what do you associate with that?
So paper in general was not readily available to certainly less fortunate classes of people. It was something that was disposable. It wasn't something that would be used for such a transitory purpose. Paper was used for writing or for taking notes or making lists, but not just to use as something that was immediately disposable. And even when products came into being in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, tampons and pads, they were for the upper classes because most people just didn't have the extra cash or income to pay for something that had one use and then was disposable. So for somebody to actually use something that was a more precious commodity only for the purpose of this one-time use and then throwing it away or burning it was really, I hadn't heard that before. It was usually something that could be used again, just in terms of frugality and not having a lot of extra resources or income.
Yeah.
I wonder if she used scrap paper. She probably would have had some scrap paper. But I was also, that's really fascinating. I was thinking about the petticoats, and Layla, you might know this, because this is pre-crinoline. She wouldn't have had a crinoline, which would keep things, open. But I don't know what she wore as a petticoat. But I'm trying to think, there might have been horsehair petticoats, which would have been pretty stiff, but I can't imagine. But they were wearing those big puffy skirts. Layla,
There were layers underneath that would kind of hold them out, and that's what. And underwear didn't exist yet either.
Yeah,
so it's not like you could just pull on underwear and put something underneath.
You didn't have underwear, so
right. So
but I do think the stocking was quite common as well. Like there's a few mentions of sometimes even like cut off stockings that. Like thick knitted ones. If you had a heavy period, you could bring that. Yeah, exactly. So I think that was, at least for like the heavy flow, that was usually used to hold it together.
But she does write about drawers as well, quite a lot, crotchless drawers. So that's
they'd be two pieces, I think, or
yeah.
So, but that would be kind of leaky.
Yeah, but not something that would hold a pad or something.
Yeah. Someone must be working on Anne Walker's. Is there anything on Anne Walker's dress, or could be in the accounts, like what kind of petticoat she wore? I don't know.
No, it's interesting. It's one of those things that, when she writes, she knows what she means. So if she doesn't describe it in detail, it would have been so interesting to get more information on that kind of thing.
It took her a while to prepare these napkins. Like sometimes, I don't know the exact time, but it wasn't, and every month she didn't like pre-prepare it. Usually it was like shortly before the cousin would come, she started preparing.
Yeah.
So it must have been some kind of construction that took a little while to prepare.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. With the preparing for my cousin, what is
exactly
that?
this? We don't know. Yeah.
We don't know.
I always assumed the paper would also maybe go into the napkin somehow to soak up. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's my idea because it kind of makes sense. Yeah.
She kept track of her period, but she wouldn't have had to worry about being pregnant. And I used to have a phrase, lesbian menstrual amnesia, because if you have regular period, it's always a complete surprise because it's not a source of anxiety. The way it would be for a sexually active heterosexual woman. And people did know that a delayed period could be a sign of pregnancy. It's still a little, It was just one of the signs, but so it's kind of interesting that, so she might not have thought, oh, it's 28 days, it's coming. It's just like, oh, here it is, or it's coming. Yeah.
Sounds like you're just sort of extrapolating from what you guys are talking about. She's using a stocking and she's using paper. Perhaps she was almost coming up with the idea of an original sort of pad where you are creating layers, and then there's length where you can fasten the end of a stocking in the front and in the back to sort of capture things. So perhaps that was a radical new way of thinking about it. That was a little bit more absorbent than other ways.
Yeah.
But if she was talking about preparing, it could just be getting all those pieces and knowing that this was going to happen and having them all in place. It's not like going to the bathroom and having a box of stuff. But she was really being, it sounds like, inventive in ways of managing her periods and her flow.
Yes, it's really interesting too that every month seems to be a bit different. It's not like she has a go-to mode of protection. It's sometimes paper, sometimes linen, sometimes a stocking. Like she is being inventive. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so she also sometimes mentions her or her partner's cousin in connection to sex. At one point, for example, she says that Tib wanted a kiss and offered as an argument for it that she was over her cousin. Lister also mentions only being able to handle Anne Walker outside her napkin, and not being able to sleep with Anne Walker without drawers for the first time on account of Anne Walker's cousin. So to what extent do you think Lister saw her or her partner having their cousin as an obstacle for sex? And did she make any distinction between grubbles and kisses in this respect? Because often she thought of those two different practices in quite different ways. And also, is there anything else that she would avoid doing when she had her cousin? Or would she live as?
So I think in terms of like the grubbling and kisses, my understanding is always that with grubbling, you don't really have to undress. Whereas with kisses, both would take off the drawers and go to bed. So I think the grubbling occurs maybe a little bit more often despite cousin. She would say something like that. But I mean, there's also a funny incident where she got really, really drunk in 1828 with Charles Lawton and then goes upstairs with Mariana and they have a kiss, so they have sex. And she writes that she covered Mariana in blood and water. So she had her period and she might have also urinated a little bit on Mariana and doesn't really remember much after that. So she was really drunk. So, I mean, yeah, I think having the period is not always a reason not to have sex. But in the later years, yeah, she would often say, you know, no kiss. A had her cousin or she had her cousin. Like it, I think, generally they would not engage in sex. I think in terms of like what else did she not do? Probably normal stuff that we might also like. I remember in 36, she had a heavy period, so she stayed upstairs in her study writing letters all day, these kind of things. Or she didn't really like when they were courting Anne and Anne, she didn't really want to go to Lydgate when she got her period. But then she still goes and says, you know, it wasn't really much of a convenience. I think she uses some shirt or something to soak it up. Yeah.
I'm also wondering, in the later years, if she could have been having perimenopause, you know, if the periods are becoming a little, I mean, it'd be a little early, but so that I wrote a note to myself, look up when menopause was, because the period started later then than they do now, quite a bit later.
Yes.
And so I don't know when.
I mean,
I'll look that up.
I don't see, like I saw in the chat, it's also one of the questions. I didn't see any kind of reference to, I don't think from reading her diaries, you know, her period became shorter, the cycle became shorter, which probably one of the first signs, but I don't think she was in premenopause yet.
Yeah, maybe a little early. Yeah.
I didn't see any kind of, comments towards that.
I would love to add, when it comes to different practices or activities when you have your period, it was much harder for women to do things back then because the way to handle menstruation was so antiquated compared to what it is now. So if you were going to go out or go horseback riding or go visiting or traveling, as you guys mentioned, you have to prepare in advance. But also, what do you do with your used materials? You know, there is no garbage can in the bathroom or a dumpster. You have to figure out where you're going to put them, carrying them with you. And so along with not necessarily feeling as well, there's also that component of how am I going to prepare and bring all this stuff with me, and how am I going to dispose of it wherever I happen to be? So that would be a period of time where women, again, women of privilege who had the money and the ability to stay home and not have to be out, at a job or taking care of children or taking care of somebody else's house, there was more freedom to be able to sit back and not be an active participant, because there were extra steps and challenges when you had your period.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that even if it seems like she didn't have very debilitating symptoms like pain and so on, and she would often do things that other women didn't do, there was this practical issue of where do I dispose of my sanitary products. So yeah, that's
change a pad, or there wasn't necessarily a public bathroom.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. So being at somebody's house or being out on a horseback ride or in a carriage, there's a practicality of dealing with menstrual, symptoms, but also all the pieces that go along with it that would be taken into consideration.
Great. My last question before we move on to the audience questions is about the extent to which she spoke about menstruation to other women. So in 1825, she writes that Mrs. Barlow talks to her about being unwell, which refers to menstruation, and that Lister has aired napkins before her. According to her, this shows that Mrs. Barlow considers her too much as a woman, and Lister compares Mrs. Barlow unfavorably to Mariana, who never seems to notice these things. To what extent would menstruation be spoken about between women at this time, and to what extent does Lister conform to or depart from the norm in this respect?
That's a great question. Again, so little is written about it that there isn't historical data to go back to and say, oh yes, this was a comfortable conversation, or this was something that people didn't talk about. I've read about communal boiling pots. There was definitely something about, there were these sort of theories about women who live together menstruate together, and so that there might be a sense of community in a larger sense because people are having the same experience at the same time, although that hasn't been proven true. And it could be that today's mindset about menstruation, and that it's so secretive and it's something that you shouldn't talk about, perhaps wasn't as prevalent back then, because people were having this experience, and if you were sharing material or in a household where certainly a woman who might have servants, people are going to know, right? Wasn't so easy to hide. Now you quietly go into a bathroom and dispose of things, but if you're in a house and somebody's changing your beds or washing your crinolines or putting out your clothing, other people would know in a way that in current day wouldn't. So it could be was more of a conversation, or at least something that was tacitly acknowledged by other people in a community or a household.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think also like other people, like maybe Anne Lister was not very comfortable talking about her own period. But there's enough examples of other women talking about their period to Anne Lister. So like Catherine Rawson, who tells her that she didn't have a period for 3 years. Anne Lister talks to Belcom, and I think also Duffin at some point, about other women or general women's period. So I think, it might have been Anne Lister that felt a little bit uncomfortable, or she also needed or wanted privacy for washing and these kinds of things. She was kind of particular about that. But I would also say, I think women talked about that amongst women usually.
I think it's time to move on to the audience questions. So the first one is about menopause, which we've kind of covered. What did she know about it, and was she experiencing any symptoms? You sort of said possibly, not sure, possibly signs of perimenopause. Was she aware that it was a thing that would eventually happen?
I mean, I don't know an exact example, but she must have been. I mean, women must be aware that at some point they stop bleeding. But I don't. And maybe Anna has some contextual historical.
I don't know. I just made a note to myself to look that up. This would be a great PhD topic, because I don't think there has been that much done on 19th century menstruation, because I was trying to find out about, really detailed stuff, and there isn't that much work. Well, I don't know, but I'll look it up.
But my assumption is she must have known, maybe not the reason why or how it happens or
yeah.
when it happens, but they must have known that.
Oh yeah, definitely. She would, and she was reading. She read mostly anatomy rather than like detailed medical things. Although I haven't looked post 1831. So as the later diaries get transcribed, I think we'll find out more about what kind of medical stuff she was reading. Because anatomy is more a description of the parts, and then doctors were actually moving more towards looking at processes. And as we know, they kind of lost interest in the clitoris and the orgasm, but they were really trying to figure out fertility, and whether you could, you know, how ovulation happened and the relationship of ovulation and the period. And it wasn't until the 40s that they learned that they could discover the egg. Well, the 1820s and then 1840s, and that there were experiments on dogs. Like they were wondering whether heat was the same as you know, animals being in the heat, same as the period, and realized it wasn't. But it was still an open debate. But sorry, that's not about menopause. I was just reassociating. I don't know.
No, that's great. Very interesting. Thank you. There's also a question about materials. Does she favor any particular material when she's traveling versus when she's at home? Does anyone know? It's a good point.
I only remember like one instance just now. I think I don't remember which. They were somewhere in the mountains and they were preparing to go. I think it was in 34 on horseback, and she writes that she took, I think maybe 1 or 2 like napkins with, because she knew she's going to get a period while they're on the mountains, so she takes a napkin. That's what I hear most often. Napkins. Paper, not so much. Just when
but
she's burning it. But yeah.
A napkin is more about what she uses it for than the material, right? So a napkin could mean.
Oh, yeah, I know
like,
the material.
She sometimes says, "I used a stocking as a napkin" or something like that. But yeah,
I don't know what the material was.
Paper seems to be a bit rarer, maybe. Yeah, good question. Sorry, we don't have answers to everything. Did she ever mention cramping? Don't think so.
At least not in the late years regarding to herself. I know, like I said, Anne Walker was poorly, and I think Balcom references like back pain in regards to like when the menstruation starts irregular in the beginning, she might experience some pain because of that. She uses like a stomach tin and these kind of things, but I'm not sure in how much that relates to her period starting or just generally being poorly, because she has sometimes a cold stomach or she warms her stomach on Anne Lister, so it might be related to PMS. Would have to correlate, like if it actually matches up with her getting the period as well. I haven't checked that yet, but she definitely, I think Anne Walker definitely had experienced some form of PMS.
I think that back then, you know, people didn't necessarily associate symptoms with menstruation,
right?
And so because not a lot was known and there wasn't education, and people in a period of expertise weren't sharing like, oh, this is what PMS is, and these are the kinds of symptoms, and as your uterus is cramping, you might experiencing things. So that wasn't a conversation that existed yet. People didn't know. And so many symptoms were ascribed to menstruation and to periods that were not related back then. So, you know, we talked about this when we were preparing for this, that, you know, women at that time, there was a diagnosis of hysteria, and hysteria was based on a malfunctioning uterus. The Greek word for a uterus was hystera. And so anything could be ascribed to some uterine problem. So it could be headaches, it could be epilepsy, it could be seizures, it could be stomach aches, it could be bowel dysfunction, it could be mental distress. We're all seen as symptoms of uterine problems. And so periods and PMS and menopause were all caught up in there, where people, you know, during like Salem witch trials, and people were seen as who didn't menstruate anymore as having like some evil or dark power. And that's why women were considered witches. It was the elder women of a community who stopped menstruating. And so there was a patriarchal mindset that was holding on to some sort of dark power. So there's so many not factual sort of facts assigned to menstruation in society. And so for her knowing the cramping was necessarily related to her period, or if other symptoms that she was having were or weren't, is like a very big question mark when there weren't a lot of facts to go on.
She also notoriously had bowel problems, which she writes a lot about as well, right? So
Right.
Yeah,
to
but
her-
I think that's also a sign
sometimes
of the
it may be
changing times.
that they
Like,
sort
I
of
mean,
occur to
the whole hysteria, I think that was changing during that time, and it was more about your guts and your intestinal health that was related to mental health. So that's why they keep giving Anne Walker laxatives and opening pills and stuff like that, because they feel like if your bowels are working, if the bowels are empty and stuff, your mind is going to be relieved. So I think the belief kind of shifted from like everything is hysteria and uterus related to, oh, hold on, it's the bowels, because there is a relation. They're not completely wrong about that. It's just a little bit more complex.
And that was also the idea that you have to, like, you purge the menstruation, all kinds of purging. It does go back to the ancient Greeks of just, purging. I mean, they're slightly changing ideas in the 19th century. One thing I came across is that a treatment for mental illness in asylums was Indian hemp, which is cannabis. And sometimes used as a treatment for menstruation. So you can just imagine, you get to, I mean, for masturbate and then get high. So, but they had no idea what they were doing. They were still bleeding, doing bleeding at this time.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. So there have been quite a few questions about servants, partly about whether servants would help with the preparing of materials, and that has kind of been answered. It seems like she did her preparing herself, right? But then there was also a question about servants having their period and whether they would be allowed to rest if they had symptoms, for example. Does anyone have any insight into this?
No, but I would sort of assume no.
Yeah.
I would assume your job is your job. And I did see a comment in the thread about how what was different for working class women. And it was different for working class women. I've read stories where, during the Industrial Revolution, factories were layered with straw on the floor. And so that women would bleed on the straw and it would be cleared out at the end of the week. And so having your period or having cramps didn't seem like, for most people, to be an opportunity to take some time and rest and have a cup of tea. You just kind of had to suck it up and go to work. It was the people with a little bit more privilege who had the opportunity to do that.
Great. I think that's all the questions. I hope you've had your questions answered. If not, you can, of course, get in touch with us after the session as well. Any final comments from any of the panelists? Anything you feel like you wanted to say that hasn't been discussed?
I just would love to add that it's fascinating that so many people are so interested in this, and that somebody from such a long time ago took the time to do this and create this bounty of research and insight into the lives of women at a time where the lives of women were so poorly chronicled. And so I appreciate all the attention to detail and the fascination with this whole audience in sort of exploring, discovering what a woman's life was when we didn't really know what a woman's life was.
Yeah, absolutely. And someone says in the chat, welcome to the world of Anne Lister, Alyssa, because you're the one who's new to her. So
I'm very glad to be
great.
here, and I'm looking forward to learning more for sure.
Great.
That's great to have ideas for further research on this too.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I think this discussion has shown how little we actually know about it. So there's definitely room for more research. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session.
Thank you, Meta, for organizing
Thank you.
it.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you to all the panelists, of course.